humblemud.
Gainground is a Sega Genesis gem hidden in plain sight. This game is in practically every Genesis compilation you can think of. It was a reasonably successful hit in arcades when it first dropped, it's got a novel concept and sick box arts. And anecdotally, anyone I've ever talked to who has actually put some time into it, especially with friends, says it's a great experience. The problem is, and the reason I say this is a gem hidden in plain sight, is no one talks about it. The game is rarely included in top Sega Genesis games lists unless it's in the last quarter of a top 100 list or something. It's never received a sequel, and outside of its inclusion in Genesis compilations, Gainground's legacy stops at some admittedly cool throwback levels inside the 3DS game Project X Zone. As is my mission with a lot of the videos I make, today I want to shine some light on this wonderful and often forgotten game, encourage you to give it a try, and hopefully find the 12 fans this game still has in the comments below. First, what even is Gainground? Gainground is a top-down strategy shooter developed by Sega. In this game, you are basically playing as time-traveling warriors who do battle through various time periods, from the primitive caveman era to the robotic future. Gameplay-wise, Gainground was heavily influenced by Gauntlet, but instead of quickly traveling through cramped corridors, annihilating mobs of enemies, and searching for keys and gems while your health slowly dwindles, you'll instead find yourself playing a much more slow-paced and methodical game, where enemies are perched up at specific locations to try to stop you from making your way to the exit. There are two ways to beat a level. One is getting each of your characters to the exit, and I do mean each of them, and the other is to defeat every enemy on screen. And in a lot of levels, you'll want to hit up that exit because that's the only way that you can actually recruit new characters. You see, on certain levels, you'll find other heroes being held hostage by the enemy. If you can get in there, grab them, and bring them safely to the exit, you can then use them in the next level, which you definitely want to try to do because all of the characters have different abilities, movement speeds, and strategies. So, as you may guess, the best way to play this game is to take out enough enemies to carve a safe path to the exit so that you can save any hostages with your first hero or two, and then bring in one last character to take out those remaining enemies so you can earn the maximum points and beat the timer. It should also be noted that Gainground is one of the best multiplayer experiences that you can have on the console. Yeah, everything moves kind of slowly here, but if you play this with another friend, trust me, you'll have a blast experiencing all of those moments weaving in and out of enemy fire. So that's Gainground in a nutshell. It's a great Genesis game, and to be honest with you, it was the first Sega Genesis game that I ever fell in love with. If you like retro gaming, you need to try this game. But it's not only on the Sega Genesis. In fact, there are 5 versions of this game. Now, if you didn't know that, I don't blame you. Only the arcade and Genesis versions were actually released worldwide. Europe got a version for the Sega Master System, and Japan got versions for both the PC Engine CD and the PlayStation 2. Thankfully, all of these are pretty easy to find nowadays though in this internet age. So if you're wondering which one you should play, well, you're in luck because I tried all of them in an effort to decide which one I thought was the best, and the results were pretty interesting. I'm going to break it all down into categories so that we can directly compare every element of each version. First, let's start with the graphics. The arcade version of Gainground was oriented with a vertical screen, which you may know as Tate mode. This means that if you're playing the game on a device with a traditional horizontal orientation, the actual game screen can appear quite small, but if you're playing the arcade archives version on Switch, for example, you can actually rotate the screen to play vertically, which is pretty cool. Gainground on the arcade has a decent amount of detail, but the characters on screen are pretty small, and I think the coloring of this game is just a tad on the flat or desaturated side. I mean, the grass really looks like it needs some rain. The Sega Genesis port, while it's not necessarily bright and colorful, the Genesis version is definitely more colorful than the arcade and has a little bit of that signature Genesis grit in its design. It should also be noted that the Genesis version is in that typical 4:3 aspect ratio like you come to expect with other home console games of the time, and the devs squished the map so that the whole thing would still be visible on just one screen like the arcade. As a result, you get some bigger character sprites, and I think the Genesis also does a great job maintaining a level of detail similar to the arcade. When it comes to the Sega Master System version, obviously being the one on the weakest machine of the bunch, it has less detail. However, I like the color palette of this version the best. It really pops, and I think the character portraits are really well done for an 8-bit game. Keep in mind though, player 1 always has to play as male characters while player 2 has female characters compared to the other versions of this game which feature a mix of genders across the board. This version still keeps everything on one screen like the arcade and Genesis versions do, and while there is some flicker at times, I still think it's pretty impressive just how many enemies you can get on screen in this version. In fact, the Master System version of this game often has more enemies per level than the other versions do, especially in 2-player. When it comes to Gameground SX on the PC Engine CD, you'll notice that the screen is much more zoomed in and you can't see the whole stage on one screen. It makes sense, after all, the SX stands for Scroll Extra in reference to how the screen scrolls when you move towards its edges. As a result of that zoomed in screen, you do get much larger overworld sprites of the characters and enemies, which I really enjoy, but the character portraits are about the same as they are on the arcade and Genesis versions. Now, you would think that zoomed in screen would make the game a lot harder, but it actually doesn't at all. More on that later though when we get to the gameplay portion. The PlayStation 2 version of this game is the most graphically complex one here, as you would assume, but admittedly it looks somewhere between the PS1 and PS2 when we're talking graphics, if I'm being honest. There are 3 camera options in this version of the game, and while some of the angles look really cool, admittedly, I don't think any of the angles are quite right compared to that top-down one that you get in the other versions of this game. The way that the arrows actually fly towards the screen before dropping back down is a really cool touch though, and I love the little chibi designs of the characters on the overworld. Definitely my favorite thing about this one graphically though is the character portraits. The character portraits in this version of the game are freaking amazing. No joke, growing up with the Genesis version of Gameground, I always thought this dude was basically Baraka from Mortal Kombat with big vicious teeth, but the PlayStation 2 version clearly shows that he's actually just a buff dude with a luscious mustache. Whoops. Now, when it comes to graphics, it was hard for me to pick which one I like the best, but I think I actually have to go with the PC Engine CD version. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of how the game scrolls as you go up the screen. I much prefer being able to see everything at once, but I think it's a fair trade-off when you consider that you get to look at those big detailed sprites. Alright, and now let's get to the sound. First, let's get one thing clear. Gameground has always had good musical compositions. No matter which version of the game you're going to play, you're going to hear some good songs. The main theme that plays in the first level is so catchy. It's one of those melodies that's going to stick in your head long after your first play session. However, I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of the arcade version's sound. The drums kind of sound like they're tripping over one another. The Genesis version though is a big step up in my opinion. This is the version I grew up with and I adore it. Another thing I really love specifically about the Genesis version is that it has hands down the best sound effect for when the Glow Knight activates his energy orbs. Doesn't that sound awesome? Now compare that to any of these versions. It's just not the same. The Master System version of Gameground has an awesome opening theme unique to it, which I adore. Also, I think its 8-bit renditions of the themes from its beefier counterparts are great. Now, the PC Engine CD version was the first version of this game to have CD quality audio, and it definitely shows. I really like a lot of the sonic landscapes you'll hear in some of the later levels of this game. They kind of remind me of stuff like Dragon Quest. I actually don't enjoy the primitive age theme, the theme that I kind of consider the main theme of the game. In this version of the game, it just doesn't quite go in the direction that I was hoping for. However, the PlayStation 2 version has easily the most awesome version of this theme. Take a listen to this. While I do think the PC Engine CD takes the cake when it comes to some of the more ambient and softer themes, the music of the Master System version is really well done and has a lot of charm, and the sound of the Genesis version is iconic, of course. That PlayStation 2 iteration of the opening theme alone is enough for me to crown that version of the game the champ sonically. This is how you bring a theme song from a 16-bit game to the edgier 6th generation. Alright, the most important thing, gameplay. Now, every version of Game Ground shares that really unique core feature of rescuing hostages and recruiting them for the next level. And while the designs differ here and there, each version has roughly the same characters and archetypes. The one exception is the Master System version, oddly enough. It has a playable wizard in place of the Water Knight, and the completely original ninja class who can trap enemies and throw shurikens, which is pretty sick. The arcade, PS2, and PC Engine CD versions have 40 levels each, while the Master System and Genesis have 50. The Genesis version has the present day era, while the Master System version has the ominous final era. When it comes to the speed of this game, the Genesis version does appear to be the slowest, and the arcade version isn't much faster. Game Ground SX on the PC Engine CD is still pretty slow, but it's a little faster, and the PlayStation 2 version feels about the same as these other versions. However, this version is the exception once again. The Master System version is noticeably faster. Oh my gosh, this version of the game actually feels more like a top-down shooter than the other ones here. Everyone has so much more mobility, and since the game is faster, you also have more enemies to deal with. Another really special thing about the Master System version is the boss fights. This game has hands down the best boss fights, and many of them are unique to this version of the game. The final boss of the first age of this game are the same stationary demons across every other version of Game Ground. However, the primitive age Master System boss is this huge dude who actually moves around on screen. It's actually kind of wild just how different the Master System version is. Another version that's quite different from the others is the PC Engine CD version. Oddly enough, this one is by far the easiest. It feels like the player character is a lot more mobile than enemies. Some of the bosses are pretty dumb and can be cheesed, and if you've played any other version of Game Ground before, you're really not going to face much of a challenge in the PC Engine CD version until you get about to that final age. I believe this tone down in difficulty was likely done so because, unfortunately, the PC Engine CD version is also the only version of this game that is single player only. This is for sure the biggest flaw of that version because even the Genesis and Master System versions that came before it allowed 2 players to play simultaneously, and the arcade version had 3 players. Speaking of that arcade version, Game Ground Arcade is brutal. It is a quarter sucker, as you can imagine. I'm sure 3 players would make this one easier, but it's honestly just not very fun solo in my opinion. The Genesis version is also hard, but it's fun at the same time in a sort of old school game kind of way. The PlayStation 2 version is somewhere between the Genesis and arcade versions when it comes to difficulty, but I feel like its camera angles and the arrows that obscure the screen a little at times make it unintentionally more difficult, as cool as those things admittedly are. The PS2 version does have difficulty options, but even on easy, it's still pretty challenging. Now, there's also an extra mode you can unlock on the PlayStation 2 version, literally called Extra Mode, if you beat the game under certain conditions, but I'm not really motivated to do that solo, to be honest, so I can't comment on that. But which one do I think is the most fun to play? Well, I never thought I'd say this in a million years, but I've got to give the gameplay award to the Sega Master System version. This one is so fun. The characters move at a great pace, and though you've got to deal with more enemies, it's got a difficulty that feels just right. While the PC Engine CD version is fun, it's a little too easy at times. Meanwhile, the other versions can be a little too difficult, especially when you're playing by yourself. Okay, so we've covered graphics, sound, and gameplay, and if you noticed, a different version won each category. So deciding the overall winner was extremely hard. I actually went back and forth between 4 of the 5 versions of Game Ground several times to try and decide. Notice I said 4 out of 5. Well, an easy elimination for me was the arcade version, oddly enough. Yeah, 3 players is cool, but this one is just not as fun to look at or play as the others, especially today. In my opinion, Game Ground is actually a good example of those rare occurrences where the home console version is actually better than the arcade version. This one was also a shocker for me. The next lowest game on the totem pole, in my opinion, is actually the PlayStation 2 version. Look, I really wanted this version to be my favorite as it's the most modern, quote-unquote version that there is out there, and while I love the hard rock metal soundtrack and the character portraits, it just doesn't feel good to play. I think the biggest sin that this version commits are its camera angles. It might be hard to tell in the footage, but the most appealing camera angle in my eyes actually hinders the gameplay, and the camera angle that benefits the gameplay the most is the least fun to look at. The remaining three are the ones I get stuck between the most, and I'll tell you now, the Genesis, Master System, and PC Engine CD versions are great ways to play Gameground overall. However, I do think the Genesis and Master System versions do just edge out the PC Engine CD version, and that's mostly because of the lack of a multiplayer mode. Multiplayer Gameground is a truly magical experience in the same way that going from single to multiplayer in Gauntlet is. And while I do think the Master System version has a ton going for it in the way of gameplay and unique features, the Genesis version has one unfair advantage, and that's availability. The thing is, if you have a modern console of some sort and are interested in retro games, you likely already have Gameground somewhere or can easily obtain it. The Genesis version is the one that's the most widely distributed. It's included in all of those Sega collections. The Genesis version was the one on the Virtual Console back in the day, and the Genesis version is the one most people are going to be familiar with. And while it didn't win any of the individual categories I discussed earlier, the overall package of Gameground on the Genesis is just rock solid. Multiplayer is great, it runs great, the graphics are better than the arcade in my opinion, the OST is catchy with solid instrumentation, the difficulty is challenging for sure but not unfair, it has the best exclusive time period in the form of the modern day era, and as I said earlier, it's the most easily obtainable version. The slower pace of this game also means that it has the most moments, because your characters are often just barely fast enough to dodge those enemy projectiles. And I think the slower pace of this game also gives it the most strategic depth. And so I think if there's any version that you should start with, it should be this one. In the end though, it's up to you, and I'd highly recommend any of these three versions in particular to try out for yourself. Do give Gameground a try, please. As I said earlier, this thing is a gem hidden in plain sight. It's everywhere, yet it often feels like no one's tried it, and if they did, they didn't give it a fair enough shot. Grab a buddy and give it a go. I'm telling you, you will have a blast. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna play some more Master System Gameground. On second thought, that might actually be my favorite. I still can't decide. Anyway, please let me know which one you're going to try, since you're now contractually obligated to if you made it this far in the video. If you're still here, thanks so much for watching, and as always, stay humble. You know what? I think the Master System version is the best.